with Bonding with the Book, Chapter Book Edition. We are reading The Unicorn Rescue Society. We are now on Chapter 5. Yes, a whole hand, 5 chapters in. But you know how we do around here. Before we get started, the first thing we do is we start with a little laughter with our joke of the day.
Our joke of the day is, what did the ocean say to the pirate? What do you think? Nothing. It just waved.
That was a funny one. What did you think of the joke of the day? How about if you have a really good joke, send it to me and maybe we can make it our joke of the day for one of our upcoming chapters. Now it's time for our chapter 4 recap. A lot of things happen in chapter 4. Let's jump right in. One of the things that we learned in chapter 4 is we learned a lot about the Pine Barren Woods. They gave us some information about it. They told us about the animals. They told us about the plants. They told us about the water. They even told us about some possible treasures. Let's dig in deep. Let's break that down. Let's start with the Pine Barren Woods description. Now, you know me, you may have it up here, but you always want to take the time to go look in a book. So we're going to go look in our book, and on page 18, which is the very beginning of chapter 4, we get a really great description of what the Pine Barren looks like. It says here, and we'll start right at the top of the page. The path they followed was dry and sandy, like most of the soil in the Pine Barrens. That's why it's called barren, because most things can't grow in soil like that. But pine trees can, and they crowded in the path, squeezing out the sunlight. Up and down the trunks, branches stuck out like crazy angles with bristling needles at the end. Long beards of gray-green moss hung down, making the trees look like old men. The cicadas hummed so loudly they sounded angry. That's a pretty vivid description. Now, while the images behind me is not the Pine Barren Woods, it's kind of what they were talking about. Not a lot of green, little green, lots of barren and not having a lot of leaves on it, trees. So we learned what it looks like. It's not very lush or lots of green, but we also learned a lot about the animal life that lived there. If we kept reading in chapter 4, we learned about all of the crazy dangerous animals that were there. Do you remember what they were? He specifically mentioned, I'm checking my notes and I'm looking in my book. Let's see. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 different animals that he mentioned that were in there that are super dangerous. Can you remember them? I'll give you some hints. One of them begins with the letter B. A bear, yes. And in alphabetical order, we had a bobcat, yes. And with the letter C, a coyote, yes. A coyote. And the last animal they mentioned that was super duper dangerous was the timber rattlesnake. And if you remember in the book, when he mentioned it, all the children quickly went from being spread out like this to single file line. Nobody wanted the timber rattlesnake to get them. So all the kids walked in a nice, neat, single file line, making sure the rattlesnake didn't get to them. We also learned about the water that was there. If you remember, the boy on the bus who farted made a statement about the water. He described the water and he said, "It looks like pee." That doesn't, first of all, if your pee looks brown, like Dr. Fauna said, you should probably go see a doctor. But all of this water was brown and it was there. And we found out some really cool information about the water. Do you remember what it was? I'll wait and let you think. And if you can't find it, where do we look? We look in our book. I'll give you a second while I get to the page. It's on page 21. If you look on page 21, it says, starting with "this water is very special." If you read that paragraph, we learn in here that that is called cedar water. What's so special about cedar water? Where Dr. Fauna goes on to explain that it has cedar sap and iron in it, which makes it taste really sweet. And a special group of people used to put it in barrels and take it. Do you remember who? He was telling us the story about the history of the water. Pirates, yes. Pirates would take it and they would take it out and keep it, and it was really sweet. But we also learned one really cool fact about the Pine Barrens Woods. Pirates used to hide treasure in the Pine Barren Woods. And that's the end of our chapter 4 recap. We learned a lot about the Pine Barren Forest and all of the cool and dangerous animals that were there, the weird, different, sweet water, and the fact that pirates used to hang out there. Now let's get into our before we read thinking questions.
Before we read, it's really important that we take time to think about some things that we can connect to the book about. What is something that you know a lot about compared to other people? It could be sports, animals, anything. I'd like to know.
Something I know a lot about is deaf, meaning people who can't hear, culture, sign language, and I watch a lot of movies and TV, so I can always find a TV reference for almost any situation. So that's something I know a lot about. What is something that you know a lot about?
Our next question is, what is the coolest plant you've ever seen? This is a hard one, but just think about it.
Now, this was a tough one. The coolest plant I have ever seen? I would say it is, I call it the rainbow plant. We have one downstairs. We went to a nursery and there's this plant that has colorful, different colored leaves. And the more sunlight it gets, the more rainbow color the leaves are. But if it doesn't get a lot of sunlight, all the leaves turn green and they shrivel up and die. I accidentally did that, but I watered it and put it back in the sun. And guess what? It's growing back and it's changing colors. So that is the coolest plant I've ever seen. What about you?
And now it's time to read. So I invite you to cozy up with your book or lend me your ears as we dive into Chapter 5 of the Unicorn Rescue Society. As Professor Fauna led the class further into the barrens, the trees became shorter and shorter. The ground became wet. Dragonflies buzzed among the plants. Everything smelled wet and rotten. There are also swamps in the Pine Barrens, Professor Fauna explained as they walked. The swamp ground is too wet for most plants. But look at this. He bent down. The children crowded around him. Miss Vole said, "Not too close, children! Not too close!" They ignored her. Professor Fauna's thick fingers were touching the weirdest plant Elliot and Uchenna had ever seen. It looked like a small green pot with purple spots all over it. This, children, is a pitcher plant. It is carnivorous, which means it eats meat. Everyone's eyes went wide. You see, Professor Fauna went on, the pitcher plant is very beautiful, but very often insects want to land on its pot-like parts to see if it has nectar inside for them to drink. But The sides of this pot are very slippery and insects fall in. And what do you think is inside this little pot? Uchenna's hand shot up in the air without waiting to be called on. She cried, "Poison!" "Uchenna!" Miss Vole exclaimed. "Be serious. Of course there isn't poison in there." Then she looked up at Professor Fauna. "Wait! Is there poison in there?" The professor gazed at Uchenna. "Ah, Miss Vole," he said, his eyes never leaving Uchenna, "there is indeed poison in this plant. The insects fall into the pot and are poisoned. Then they decompose and the plant sucks the nutrients from their bodies." His voice became very quiet. His eyes remained fixed on Uchenna. He whispered, "It is a trap." Then he straightened up, brushed off his worn tweed jacket, and said, "Did you know that many Christmas decorations come from the pine barrens? Come, let me show you." Elliot and Uchenna stared after him. "Who is this guy?" Elliot whispered. "I told you," Uchenna replied. "He's a social studies teacher."
Whoa. Whoa. A teacher took kids on a field trip with a bunch of poisonous plants. What? That's kind of bonkers to me. I just think I don't know what's going to happen next. They're poisonous plants and stuff that could eat insects, and they are just getting started. They haven't even gotten where they're going. And where are they going? They're in the woods. I guess I have to keep reading to find out what's going on. What did you think of the chapter? I do have an end of the chapter question for you.
Our end of the chapter question is, have your feelings or thoughts about Professor Fauna changed? And if so, how?
I can't wait to hear your answer. Make sure you let me know what you think. And with that, it brings us to our very last section. You know what time it is. Time to make your predictions. What do you think is going to happen in chapter 6? Are we going to meet more poisonous plants? Are we going to meet poisonous animals? Is somebody going to get bit? Are they going to disappear? I don't know. I have no idea. I'd like to hear what you think. I'm just guessing. And I'm guessing based off of the information we have so far. I'd like you to do the same. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 5. I'm so glad you took the time to come bond with this book with me, The Unicorn Rescue Society, chapter 5. Next time, we'll dive right into chapter 6. See you next time. Bye.